Episode 6, Part 05, Chapter 06. Chapter 6. The entire cavern began to shake and quiver as the statue growled, awakening all of the sleeping spirits within it. Dozens of white ghostly figures seeped out of the rock, each still dressed in full battle gear. They floated up towards the top of the cavern, beginning to swirl in a large circle across the ceiling until they were just a blur. On the ground, Cloud and the others stood frozen, watching as the spirits swirled and swirled, combining their energy. Their swirling created a gust of wind that blew throughout the whole cave, blowing through Cloud's hair and Red 13's fur, making them shiver and the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. It also blew through the torch that Bugenhagen still held, and eventually it blew so hard that the red flame was blown out, leaving them in the dark red glow of the lava. They turned their gazes back towards the giant stone carving in the wall, and watched as something began to emerge from the shadows of its face. Slowly but surely the creature emerged, tall and strong, with so much armor on its body that it looked gigantic. Like all the other ghostly figures, its clothes were tattered and torn, and its body semi-transparent and ghost-like but rapidly turning solid. It didn't take more than one guess to figure out just who this creature was. This was the ghost leader of the Gi tribe, Gi Natok. Red 13 growled fiercely as he caught the scent of the Gi leader. That scent stirred up many memories within the depths of his mind, memories that had lain suppressed for many years until this moment. Memories of the fateful day the Gi tribe attacked Cosmo Canyon, of how many of the canyon's inhabitants were brutally slaughtered, and of how his mother fought with all her strength to fight off the Gi and protect the canyon. Unable to contain his anger anymore, Red 13 suddenly leaped forward, his claws extended to their full length and his teeth so visible they glowed with the color of the lava. His muscles were powered up by his anger towards the Gi for taking his mother from him. It was that powerful hatred that made him coil his muscles and leap high up into the air, high up above Gi Natok's head. He brought in his back legs and tucked them underneath his stomach, tilting his head down towards the head of the Gi leader. He began to fall, and it was then that he pushed his hind legs out, giving him an extra burst of speed and strength as he powered down to the Gi leader's head, clamping his jaws around partially solid flesh. Gi Natok flung his head around, trying to force the hound off his helmet. Red 13 kept his grip and stayed on, his body twisting back and forth as the ghostly leader fought back. Eventually Gi Natok reached up with one long arm and wrapped his fingers around Red 13's waist, pulling him free before hurling him against one of the walls right above a pit of lava. He fell down onto a small ledge just above the lava, so close that even one slip would send him falling into it. "Red 13! Cloud called. He drew his sword and made to run forward, but as he did a sudden gust of wind made him stop and step back. The Gi leader stood with one arm raised up towards the ghostly swirl of spirits that covered the ceiling. As Cloud watched, the swirl parted for just a second, allowing two fiery balls to drop down towards the ground where Yuffie and Cloud were standing. Cloud managed to jump away in time as the fiery ball landed at his feet, but Yuffie never saw it coming. The fiery ball hit her back and sank right in, disappearing inside her body. She cried out briefly before her entire body convulsed and she fell down onto the floor. Bugenhagen was by her side in an instant, turning the girl onto her back and checking for injury. The other fiery ball was hovering in front of Cloud, and Cloud could see directly into the fire. There was a small ghostly face burning inside the flames, the face of one of the Gi tribe. The fiery ball must have been some kind of protection or shield, allowing the Gi ghost to have some sort of physical presence. The ball suddenly darted forward, and Cloud raised his sword to attack. On the far side of the cavern, Red 13 was just climbing to his feet. He looked over across the pool of bubbling lava and saw Cloud stuck in the middle of a fierce battle with the soul fire, fending off its fire attacks with the flat end of his sword. He could also see Yuffie, unconscious by Bugenhagen's side. What was important to him, however, was the Gi leader, who was standing and watching the fray with a smug satisfaction. He jumped off the small ledge he was on, just as it crumbled and fell into the lava. He landed on the main floor again and charged forward, zipping past Cloud like a blur and right through the soul fire. The spirit inside the ball made a terrible screeching sound as Red 13's claw sliced through the flame, and it disappeared with a faint pop and a sizzling sound. Red 13 didn't stop there, and charged once again towards the Gi leader to make another attack. Bugenhagen watched silently as Red 13 and Cloud made their attack on the Gi leader. Yuffie was still unconscious, but as the Gi leader cried out in pain after one good strike from Cloud, the girl's eyes snapped open. For a moment there was a flicker of flame in her normally dark eyes, and she very slowly turned her head towards Bugenhagen. A cold grin appeared on her face as she looked at the old man, and she began to stand up. Bugenhagen stared as Yuffie stood up menacingly. She turned towards him, her eyes empty but her face cold. Bugenhagen suddenly jumped back as he realized what was happening, but Yuffie held out her shuriken and placed it at the old man's throat. Fire was flickering faintly in her eyes, along with the laughing face of one of the Gi ghosts that had taken over her body.
"Move, old man,"
said Yuffie, although her voice was not her own. It carried with it the superior, laughing tone of the Gi inside her. That laugh grew even more sardonic as she began to lead the old man back, urging him towards the edge of one of the hot pits of lava. Bugenhagen had no choice but to move back. Out of the corner of his eye, Cloud saw what was happening below.
"Red 13.
He said. Red 13 looked, and in that moment of distraction the Gi leader swung out with both his arms and threw the two away from him. They fell to the floor and skidded across the rock, moving until they hit the far wall. Dust began to settle around them, as they lay dazed and barely able to take note of what was going on. Gi Natok made a horrible screeching sound that vibrated throughout the walls of the cavern. In response Yuffie nodded and continued to move forward, her shuriken just centimeters away from cutting Bugenhagen's neck. They were right next to the lava pit now, and Yuffie edged her shuriken forward to make Bugenhagen move over the edge.
"Stop!"
cried a female voice from the far end of the cave. Yuffie barely had time to turn as a huge white blob of fur suddenly pounced from behind and landed on her back. Bugenhagen quickly floated up and away from the pit as the girl fell forward onto the ground, her shuriken clattering beside her. The girl screeched as she turned her head, glaring as she saw the huge white body of Catchi sitting on her back, pinning her arms down so she could not move. Cloud and Red 13 looked up from the ground and saw Catchi pinning Yuffie down. They stared in complete surprise, and in even more surprise as they saw Eris standing at the entrance to the cave, a small bottle in her hand.
"Cloud,"
she called to him.
"Use this. It should kill it."
She then threw the small blue bottle up into the air, throwing it towards Cloud. Cloud stood up and caught the bottle firmly in his hands. He pulled off the top and the healing scent of mint filled his lungs as he breathed in. It was normally used for healing, but to an undead creature it was deadly. Seeing his possessed servant trapped beneath Catchi's bulk, Gi Natok roared fiercely and charged forward towards Cloud and Red 13. Cloud quickly hurled the bottle up into the air, the glittering clear liquid of the potion flying out in small drops. The bottle landed on the Gi leader's head, smashing into many pieces of blue glass that fell around the creature like rain. The liquid poured over Gi Natok's body and spread rapidly. Normally this potion would cure and heal wounds, but as it spread down over Gi Natok's ghoulish form, it made his skin steam. He was still moving forward at that point, but as he continued to charge his form began to fade, rapidly being dissipated by the power of the potion. In fact, when he reached Cloud he was nothing more than a transparent image, passing right through Cloud and disappearing on the other side in a rush of wind and dust. A single ball of materia fell when it disappeared, rolling to the ground. Up in the air, the ghostly spirits that were still spinning in the air all screamed angrily, spinning faster and faster. With a sudden burst of speed they scattered, disappearing into the cave walls and out of sight once again. The ghostly presence inside Yuffie began to disappear too. The girl shuddered and cried out as the ghost inside left her body and disappeared into the air, retreating now that its leader had been vanquished. Once it was free of Yuffie's body she fell limp, and Cat slowly climbed off her back. The cave soon fell silent again. The aura of hatred that had filled the cave before had disappeared now, leaving the cave with a calm and almost serene feel. The giant stone carving of Gi Natok's mask had disappeared as well, leaving just a blank stone wall with a single doorway leading through to the final area. With all the ghosts gone, Eris walked fully into the cave and knelt beside Red 13, who was just climbing to his feet. There was a gash on the side of his back leg, but luckily it wasn't serious. While she was busy helping him up, Bugenhagen floated down from the ledge he had been hiding on, and stopped beside Cloud.
"Thank you, Cloud. Because of you, we survived,"
he said gratefully. Cloud nodded, and Bugenhagen turned to Red 13.
"Nanaki, you have grown strong, too."
Red 13 looked up at his grandfather.
"Oh yeah?"
he asked. Although he desperately tried to hide it, it was clear that Red 13 was extremely proud to hear Bugenhagen say those words. Bugenhagen nodded.
"Now I know that it wasn't a mistake bringing you here,"
he said. He went over to the fallen torch and picked it up. Its fire was out now, but as Bugenhagen passed his hand over the top of the wood it caught fire again, and the brighter light filled the cave as the old man walked over to the last door.
"Come, I have something I want to show you."
With the torch now lighting the way again, Bugenhagen proceeded to walk through the final door with Red 13. As they walked through, Cloud turned towards Eris and Cat, who were standing behind him.
What are you guys doing here, anyway?
He asked them. He was surprised when Cat suddenly turned away from him, the mog's foot tapping anxiously on the ground. He turned to Eris for answers, and was equally surprised to find the girl grinning at him happily.
It was Cat's idea,
Eris said.
He didn't like the idea of you all coming down here alone, so we decided to help you. By the looks of things, we came at a good time.
Cloud nodded. They certainly had come at a good time. If they hadn't have intervened, the spirit possessing Yuffie could have turned her on anyone. At least now the Gi leader was at rest and all the other spirits fading away into the life stream at last. Then he, Eris and Cat followed on through the door, leaving Yuffie alone in the lava-filled cave.
I told you I didn't like this place,
she complained, although no one could hear her.
Why wouldn't anyone listen to me?
In a fury, she slammed her fist onto the ground, making the earth around her shake a little. Raising her eyes, she saw the green ball of materia dropped by the Gi tribe leader. Although it was green on the outside, she could see a dark hole inside it, coming from the power of gravity it held within it. Cautiously she crawled over to it, and in a single quick movement she snatched it up and held it in her hands, before slipping it into her pocket. She then stood up and followed Cloud and the others. Red 13 was surprised when he emerged from the tunnel. He was surprised because he found that he was no longer inside the canyon. Up above him there was the clear sky filled with the stars of the heavens, and a cool, gentle breeze was blowing through the air. There was a rugged path around him, as well as a tall cliff accessible only from the large rocks that jutted up out of the earth. As Red 12 stepped out and looked up, his one good eye opened up wide in an expression of both amazement and fear. For a second he couldn't move, instead listening to his heart beginning to beat faster than he thought possible, and feel the blood pulse through his head. His paws trembled as he walked up to the first rock, the rough surface feeling awkward against the soft padding. With a sudden burst of energy he jumped up to the next rock, his neck sore as he strained to look up.
This is...
he said, but he couldn't finish his sentence. His voice simply refused to finish the words he was trying to say. Behind him, Bugenhagen slowly floated towards the first rock, slowly nodding his head.
The warrior who fought against the Gi,
he said, his voice echoing slightly around the canyon.
He kept them from taking even one step into Cosmo Canyon. But he was never able to return to town.
Red 13 slowly turned and looked at him, and Bugenhagen nodded.
Look, Nanaki. Look at your father, at the warrior, Seto.
Red 13 did look. His gaze wandered back towards the top of the cliff, where a large stone figurine was standing. He had recognized it instantly, even after all these years. He remembered the large bulk of the hound-like body, with muscles powerful enough to carry more than twice his own weight. Around his head were the markings of his tribe, the many red feathers symbolizing his age and his status. Red 13 had no choice but to recognize him. The only thing now was that his entire body was stone. Many arrows had pierced the hound's skin and were still there, turned to stone like the rest of him. He was frozen in a proud, firm stance, glancing over the rest of the canyon like a guardian.
That's Seto.
Bugenhagen nodded again, and also looked up at the stone statue.
Seto continued to fight the Gi tribe here. To protect this canyon.
He explained to the younger hound.
Even after the Gi's poisonous arrows turned his body to stone. Even after they all ran away. Seto continued to protect us. And he continues to protect us, even now. Even now.
Red 13 whispered in awe. He could not believe the story he was hearing, nor could he believe that what he was seeing was actually real.
You thought that he was a coward and ran away. But he, alone, risked his life to protect Cosmo Canyon. That is your father, Seto.
Red 13 closed his eyes and shook his head, and looked back.
That is Seto?
He turned his head round and looked at Bugenhagen.
Did mother know? Ho ho ho.
She knew, replied the old man, nodding as he laughed.
The two of them made me promise to keep this cave shut. They asked me to seal it myself and not to tell a soul. They said we should forget about this cave.
Gradually, Red 13 lowered his gaze to look at the stone floor, mumbling quietly under his breath. He could not believe that he had been so stupid for all these years. All this time he had always believed that his father had run away during the battle with the Gi, leaving his mother for dead so that he might live. He had built up a deep hatred for his father because of that. Now he was seeing his father again, the truth finally revealed, and he couldn't say a word. Bugenhagen turned away from Red 13 and looked at Cloud and the others, who had entered the cave moments after they did.
Cloud. Would you mind leaving the two of us alone?
He asked humbly. Cloud looked over at Red 13, whose tail was now hanging limp on the ground. Understanding, he nodded at Bugenhagen and then turned away, motioning Eris, Catchy and Yuffie to follow him back through the cavern to wait for them. Once Cloud and the others were gone, Bugenhagen turned back to Red 13.
Nanaki,
he said, his voice suddenly growing rather stern.
I want you to continue your journey with Cloud and the others.
Red 13's ears pricked up in an instant, and he turned to face Bugenhagen.
Grandpa!
He exclaimed, shocked. Before he could say any more, Bugenhagen raised a hand and shook his head.
Listen, Nanaki. Cloud says they are trying to save the planet. Honestly, I don't think it can be done. For even if they stop every reactor on the planet, it's only going to postpone the inevitable. Even if they stop Sephiroth, everything will perish. But, Nanaki. I've been thinking lately. I've been thinking if there was anything we can do, as a part of the planet, something to help a planet already in misery. No matter what happens, isn't it important to try? Am I just wishing against fate? I am too old to do anything about it. This year, I'll be 130. Ho ho ho. That is why, Nanaki, you must go with them. For my sake. Grandpa. I wanted to show you your real father before you left.
The old man continued. As he spoke he turned away, his voice suddenly quietening down to almost a whisper.
I'm so glad that you came back while I was still alive to show you. Grandpa. Don't talk like that,
Red 13 said, turning his head away to hide the faint specks of salty water forming in the corner of his eye. He didn't want Bugenhagen to see him cry.
I don't want to think of life without you. Ho ho ho. Well, I've had a long life.
The old man began.
Grandpa. You must live.
Bugenhagen looked up in surprise at the volume of Red 13's outburst. He had raised his voice until he was almost shouting, and there was an expression on his face unlike anything he had ever seen before on Red 13's face. For a moment he seemed like a completely different person.
I'll see to it,
the hound said firmly, digging his claws into the rock.
I'll see what's happening to the planet. And I'll come back to tell you. Nanaki.
The old man watched as Red 13 suddenly jumped down from the rock he was standing on and landed a meter away from Bugenhagen. Bugenhagen could see something different about the way Red 13 moved, there was a sudden fluidity in the way his muscles uncoiled to let him reach the floor, and something very familiar in the determined gaze in his eye.
I am Nanaki of Cosmo Canyon,
shouted Red 13, his voice raging with a strength he had never shown before.
The son of the warrior, Seto. I'll come back a warrior true to that noble name. So please, Grandpa.
Bugenhagen continued to stare at Red 13, unable to believe that the young hound he was looking at was still the same one. He stared and stared until an eerie silence spread between them, only broken by a sudden faint sound. Red 13 turned around and looked behind him, just in time to see a drop of crystal clear water fall down onto the rocks. It splashed into many tinier drops, each one so clear they were able to give a perfect reflection of Red 13's face before they hit the rock again and trickled down the side. Another drop of water fell beside it, and Bugenhagen looked up, his mouth falling open as he gazed.
That's Seto's. Seto. Seto.
Red 13 stammered, his voice shaking.
Father.
He coiled his muscles and leaped back up onto the next rock, just in time to see another drop of clear water fall from above and splash onto the ground. On top of the cliff, the petrified form of Seto stood firmly as it overlooked the canyon. Although he was seemingly silent, Red 13 and Bugenhagen watched together as a small stop of water appeared at the edge of Seto's stone eye, and began to roll down the side of his face. It dripped off the end of his face and tumbled towards the ground, another tear of sadness and joy. Seeing those tears fall from his father's face, Red 13 could bear it no longer. He threw back his head and howled loud into the night, the sound of his voice echoing inside the canyon just as his father's tears fell onto the ground. Father and son. United at last. Yet never to touch again. By the time midnight came, Cloud and the others were still waiting around the campfire in the middle of Cosmo Canyon. They had left Red 13 and Bugenhagen alone in the depths of the canyon, knowing it was safe now that all the ghosts were finally laid to rest. Slowly, Cloud looked around at the others.
"Shall we get going?"
he asked, breaking the silence. One by one the others looked up at him. Although they had known all along that Red 13 planned to leave their group at Cosmo Canyon, saying goodbye suddenly made it seem all the more real. It was probably easier to leave without saying goodbye, but it didn't stop them from feeling a little sad at the thought.
"So this is it, Red 13?
said Eris sadly.
"That's just the way it goes,"
said Bugenhagen.
"You came in handy at times."
So they all headed towards the gate. They said their farewells to the guard who was still guarding the entrance to the canyon, before Eris and the others all began to walk back down the steps towards the buggy, which was still standing at the bottom of the stairs. Cloud stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back at the canyon. When he was ready he turned away, and began to walk down the stairs.
"Wait for me. I'm coming, too."
Cloud stopped and turned around, his eyes opening wide as he saw Red 13 leaping down the stairs of the canyon. He came to a stop beside Cloud, his furry red body breathing heavily from his long run from the dark depths. Cloud asked, confused. He looked up as Bugenhagen then began to walk down the steps towards him.
"Cloud,"
the old man said.
"Please look after Nanaki."
Cloud stared, looking from Bugenhagen to Red 13 and back to Bugenhagen again.
"What happened?"
he asked.
"I think I grew up a little,"
Red 13 replied simply.
"That's what happened."
Before Cloud could say anything more, Red 12 ran briskly past him and down the stairs towards the car. As the others all exclaimed and cheered at Red 13's cheery return to the group, Cloud looked back at Bugenhagen. The old man was smiling happily, with a knowing look that made Cloud feel that this would not be the last time they visited Cosmo Canyon. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Man with No Past. End of chapter. Episode 7, Part 06, Chapter 07. Part 6, The Man with No Past. Chapter 7. Unable to stay in Cosmo Canyon because of the lack of room, Cloud and the others had no choice but to camp out in the buggy for the rest of the night. They had driven to the end of the cliffs before parking in the safe shadow of one of the smaller cliffs, and set up camp for the night. It had been a very peaceful night, sleeping out underneath the stars. The air had been nice and cool, but not cold, and the sky remained clear all night through. Some of them had curled up inside the buggy, while others, such as Yuffie and Red 13, had chosen to rough it out on the rock and patchy grass. The only member of the group who could not enjoy the peaceful night was Cloud. He lay in the back of the buggy, his arms resting beneath his head and his legs propped up on the side of the buggy, eyes open as he looked up at the stars shining above him. Only it wasn't the cool breeze or the faint growl of Barrett's snoring that kept him awake. He was still awake because of the many thoughts that were roaming around in his head. Thoughts that had been running through his mind ever since they left the boundaries of Cosmo Canyon and entered the plains again, heading further north towards the distant mountains. Cloud recognized those mountains. Their image was burned into his memory as an everlasting picture that would never fade. The jagged gray structures of the large mountain range that stood in the center of the entire continent, it had taken them only a day or two to reach them. The gray structures of Mount Nebel, which meant that they were very close to his hometown of Nibelheim. Cloud wasn't sure he wanted to see Nibelheim again. He didn't know if he could bear it, to see the ruined wreckage of what had once been his home. He wondered if it would be like Gongaga or North Corel, left to disrepair and abandoned by the rest of the world. Cloud had no idea how many people had survived the flames. Would there be anyone he knew still alive? Thinking about it made his skin prickle, moving down his spine and making him shiver momentarily. In frustration he sat upright, bringing his legs down so that he could stand up in the middle of the buggy, and peered out into the night. The plains were dark, but he could see the faint shimmer of water coming from a river in the distance, brought to light by the moon hanging in the sky. Cloud looked up at it for a moment or two, watching the giant white orb as it looked back down at a planet crying in need and desperation. No matter how hard Cloud listened he could no longer hear the cries of the planet. Maybe they could only be heard in Cosmo Canyon, in Bugenhagen's laboratory? Thinking that made Cloud sigh with relief. He didn't want to hear those awful cries again, so pained and hurt. Was the planet really crying? Crying the way a human being could cry? And what of the life stream? Remembering the life stream, Cloud turned his head away from the river and looked down towards his large sword, which lay silently in the corner of the buggy. In particular, he looked at the red, green, and blue balls of materia that were slotted silently in the side of the blade. Made of compressed Mako energy, which came from the planet. They were the product of the life stream. Cloud knelt down beside the sword and pulled out the red ball of Ramu. Although he could see nothing through the darkness, he could feel the power inside it. Power that came from the planet. It made Cloud feel a little guilty to be using the planet's power like this, but he knew it was a power they could not afford to give up. Not if they wanted to defeat Sephiroth and Shinra. So he hoped that for a while, just a little while, the planet would allow them to use its power. Nibelheim. The group were already up and moving again by the time the yellow ball of the sun rose the next morning, peering out between the tall rocky canyons onto the grassy plain where the buggy was riding. It was going to be another bright and sunny day for sure, which was good news for them if they wanted to make good progress. They had passed the slow-flowing river with ease and were now traveling at a fast pace towards the town that stood at the silent entrance of Mount Nebel. Nibelheim. Cloud and Tifa were standing up in the back of the buggy right then, peering out over the top of the roof as Eris drove on. They ignored the sound of Barrett yelling angrily at Yuffie as she sat on the bonnet, and then Eris yelling at him for making the buggy tilt with his angry cries. Their minds were focused solely on the town they were approaching, their hearts beating in anxiety at what they would see. They expected to see the black remains of a ruined town, but as the buggy drew closer to the large break between the tall mountains of Nebel, they realized that something wasn't right. At first they couldn't quite place what it was that was wrong, but as they passed the final slope and onto the straight path that led towards the town, they saw it.
No way!
Tifa exclaimed, her eyes wide in an expression of pure disbelief. They had expected to see a wreck of burnt-down houses and decaying old vehicles, but instead they got exactly the opposite. There were no burnt-down houses left to rot, instead there were many houses, neatly built and positioned exactly as Cloud and Tifa remembered them. Driving up to the entrance they could see the side wall of the inn, staring back at them. Eris slowed the buggy to a halt and stepped out. Everyone was now looking out at the town now, staring in disbelief at the complete town that looked back at them silently. For Cloud, this was absolutely impossible. He had prepared himself to see a ruined, burned-out wreck abandoned from the world. Yet somehow, by some strange miracle or disaster, the town was standing there just as it always did. There was just no way that Nibelheim could be standing there. No way. Suddenly and without warning, Cloud jumped down from the buggy and onto the grass. Tifa was just milliseconds behind him, and followed as he ran swiftly across the grass towards Nibelheim. They ran on regardless of the fact that the others were calling out to wait for them, and focused only on reaching Nibelheim. Eventually their feet stopped pounding on frail stalks of grass and moved onto the more solid ground of the town, kicking up dust in their wake. It took them a few seconds to slow down, skidding to a stop beside the old inn. Even as they stopped their heads and eyes were already darting around, looking around in disbelief. The resemblance was uncanny. Everywhere they looked, everything seemed to be exactly as it was before it had burned down. In fact, it looked like it had never been touched. Everything was as it was, from the well in the center of town to the small wooden bridge leading towards one of the houses near the entrance of town. The streets were just as quiet and dusty, and it still looked like a deserted ghost town. Only this time it was more of a ghost town, for it shouldn't have been standing.
What?
Tifa exclaimed, her voice almost choking in her disbelief as she looked around. Looking past the well she choked again as she saw the familiar sight of her house, or what had once been her house a long time ago.
This was all supposed to be burnt down, right?
Cloud nodded slowly. He was also looking past the well, but on the opposite side, where the structure of what had been his childhood home stood silently alongside Tifa's, exactly as it had once done.
I thought so. Then why? My house is still there too.
The others finally caught up to them then, leaving the buggy abandoned just outside the entrance of town. There was no point bringing it in, the only way forward was through the mountains and they would not support the buggy. They were also surprised to find the town intact, but not as surprised as Cloud and Tifa were. Throughout all the time they had been traveling, they had held the belief that Sephiroth had burnt down Nibelheim, and it was nothing more than a ruin. Yet here it was, like it had never been touched. Seeing it all, Barrett immediately snapped his head round to Cloud and pointed at him fiercely.
You said the whole town burnt down, right?
He asked. There was a strong sense of accusation in his voice that he was unable to hide.
Yeah,
Cloud replied.
Cloud,
said Cat.
did you make up your story just to get our support?
There was little accusation in his voice, but the question was there, out in the open. Even as Cloud looked at Red 13 he saw the same expression on his furry red face, and the faint sense of accusation in his eyes. Eris had turned her head away to avoid being examined, although he was sure the same thought had crossed even her mind.
I'm not lying.
Cloud replied just as fiercely, although he wasn't sure just how confident his answer was. He shook his head, recalling the memories of the fire. Thinking about it raised his spirits, for the images were clearly burned in his mind, and he became more confident.
I remember. The intense heat of the flames.
He looked up at the others. They were all glancing briefly at one another, unsure of what to think. Finally Eris walked forward and stood beside Cloud and Tifa, her mind made up. Cat, Barrett, and Red 13 finally nodded as well, but Cloud could still see faint traces of doubt in their eyes. They still weren't quite sure. The first place they headed to was the inn, since it was the closest building to them. Cloud walked in first, followed by Tifa and then the others. It was exactly the same on the inside as well, once again making Cloud wonder. He quickly dismissed those thoughts and walked towards the younger innkeeper standing patiently behind the desk, looking at them earnestly as they approached.
Hi, welcome,
he said cheerfully. It was an almost fake tone of cheerfulness, the smile on his face almost there mechanically. Cloud glanced at Tifa, who nodded. Cloud nodded back, and then turned to the innkeeper.
What's your story?
He asked, a faint touch of hostility in his voice.
This town was supposed to have been burnt down 5 years ago. What the hell is going on?
The smile on the innkeeper's face instantly disappeared, and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. He turned away for a brief moment, as though composing himself. Then he turned back, the twitch gone, and his expression turning to something of a mechanical annoyance.
Sir, don't say such awful things. I was born and raised in this town. What you say never happened.
Cloud and Tifa glanced at one another again. They remembered the old innkeeper who used to run the inn, sitting behind the desk and doing his crosswords day after day. There was no way this innkeeper had been born and raised in the town like they had been. While this was going on, Barrett was standing towards the left of the group, his arms folded and his foot tapping against the ground irritably. While he was listening to the conversation he heard a small banging noise coming from ahead of him, and he looked up towards the wooden door leading to a side room behind the innkeeper.
You're lying.
Tifa said plainly to the innkeeper, her gaze stern. It annoyed her that someone would actually pose as a resident of Nibelheim, especially when she knew that he wasn't. Making sure the innkeeper wasn't looking, Barrett silently shuffled over towards the door. It was ajar slightly, and he carefully pushed it open a crack, peering through the gap and into the storeroom that was hidden there. His eyes widened a little as he saw what was inside, but he continued to look.
Excuse me.
The innkeeper replied, the unreal tone of his voice now even more apparent than before.
That's so rude. If you're going to talk like that to me, I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
With that the innkeeper crossed his arms and turned away stubbornly, refusing to even look at them anymore. Cloud glared at the ignorant young man angrily and was about to say more, when Barrett suddenly gave a whistle and caught everyone's attention bar the ignorant innkeeper. When Cloud looked over Barrett nodded his head to the storeroom, pushing the door open wider. Cloud walked over to him and peered inside, and his eyes opened wide as well. Inside the storeroom was a man, they presumed it was a man, standing beside a pile of crates at the far end of the storeroom. They could not see any of his features because he was wearing a long black cloak that shielded him, face and all, so he was merely a dark shadow hiding away. He was trembling slightly and murmuring softly under his breath. Cautiously Cloud walked into the storeroom and stood beside the figure. He was bent over like he was crippled, and Cloud could see that he was clutching onto the ends of his cloak as he shivered, as though trying to keep warm. Something inside him urged Cloud to examine the man further. While he murmured inaudibly, Cloud slowly pulled one sleeve free and pushed it up so that he could see the man's upper arm. On the man's pale arm there was a tattoo, showing a simple number 6 in dark black.
Man in a black cape.
He said aloud.
He has a tattoo number 6.
He stopped briefly, suddenly feeling sure that he had seen this before. He could not remember at first, until he saw Eris suddenly stand beside him, a look of sympathy on her face as she gazed at the shivering man. Then he remembered. It was in Midgar, back when he and Eris first met. She had taken him to Sector 5, and shown him a man in a similar condition. He had been pale and shaking and not making much sense, and with a tattoo number 2 on his arm. Back then Cloud had thought the man was on drugs, but now he wasn't so sure. He wondered what the significance of the tattoo number was.
R.
The man mumbled suddenly, his voice louder and twisting in a way that sounded like he was going to be sick. He lifted his head slightly and tried to turn around, twisting his head round to face Cloud. Yet as much as he tried he could not turn, not while Cloud held his arm.
RRRGH. Must. Go. To. Re. Uni. On.
His voice then went quiet again, and he went back into his inaudible mumbling. Cloud slowly released his arm and turned back to the others, who had gathered by the door, and staring at the man with chills running down their spines. The man seemed unaware of their presence, as though he was possessed or at least mentally ill. They left the room, shutting the door quietly behind them and leaving the cloaked man to his muttering. Cloud decided against asking the innkeeper about the mysterious cloaked man. He would most likely deny all knowledge, although something inside him told him the innkeeper did know something about it. Leaving the inn, the group headed further into the town. They walked around the well, Tifa gazing up at it as they passed, amazed at the likeness. Even the age of the wood seemed perfect, as it would be after 5 years. She found herself falling behind then, and she quickened her pace to catch up to the others, who had stopped in front of the 2 houses that stood side by side at the far end of the town. Cloud was the first to step up to one of the houses, choosing the one on the left that resembled the house he was brought up in. The door opened with a faint creak and he walked inside, leaving the others outside. It was almost like stepping inside a memory, or passing through the doorway into another time. The house's interior was also exactly the same, without a single detail being altered in any way. Stepping into the living room, he could see the beds with their white sheets, the wooden floor and steps leading into the kitchen. His breath stopped as he looked over towards the far end of the room. There was a woman standing there, in the same spot as his mother had stood when he entered the house 5 years ago. For a moment he thought that it was his mother, until she turned and looked at him. She was younger, and her expression was cold and harsh, not like the warm, elderly look of his mother.
What is it?
The woman asked harshly, glaring at the stranger who had entered her home. Cloud stared for a few seconds more, before he stopped and shook his head. He knew he wouldn't find his mother in this house. She was dead, along with the rest of the original Nibelheim residents. When he was finished, he looked back up at the woman, trying to keep his face stern.
I want to hear your story,
he told her.
I lived in this house until I was 14.
He stopped for a moment before continuing.
No, but this town was burned down.
Like the innkeeper, the woman seemed to hesitate before answering. Cloud then realized that her face was just as mechanical and monotonous, the harsh expression seemed to have been placed there to deceive him. Then she turned a little more natural as she glared at Cloud angrily.
Are you sick? Saying those things?
She asked him, her anger sounding a little more natural than the much younger innkeeper had done.
Get out of here.
As she finished speaking, a loud, piercing scream rang through the walls of the house, followed by a much deeper voice calling Cloud's name. It was Tifa's voice that screamed, and Barrett was calling him. Hurriedly Cloud turned and ran out of the house, heading towards the open door leading into Tifa's childhood home. Cloud ran to the door and saw the others all gathered inside the house, standing in a half-circle around the door. Tifa had turned away, her hand covering her mouth to stifle her screams. He wondered what had happened to make Tifa scream like she did, until a shadow stepped out from behind the door. It was another man, also completely covered from head to foot in a long black cape. Like the one in the inn, he was trembling and muttering softly under his breath, although he could hear what this one was saying.
Must. Get.
It.
And bring. To. Se. Fi. Roth.
He mumbled eerily.
Then. Become. One. With. Se. Fi. Roth.
Cloud's eyes narrowed fiercely as the man mumbled Sephiroth's name. He reached out and grabbed the man roughly by the arm, lifting up the sleeve to look at his arm. Sure enough, there was a tattoo emblazoned on his upper arm, just as he knew there would be.
This guy's number 5.
Cloud said. Another shadow soon caught his eye, and as he looked up over Tifa's shoulder he saw that there was yet another of the cloaked men standing in the kitchen. Cloud brushed past Tifa and went to the man, also lifting up the sleeve to examine at his arm. Another tattoo was there in bold, black figures.
He has a tattoo of the number 11.
Cloud muttered.
Must.
The man mumbled as Cloud lowered the sleeve.
Go. Rion. Ion.
Cloud stepped away from him and left him to his mumbling and shaking, glancing back at the others. 3 cloaked figures, each one of them barely able to talk, and what they did say was something about Sephiroth or reunion. What link did they have to Sephiroth? He wished he knew. At that moment a loud crash came from directly above them, as though something had smashed on the floor. Without a pause Cloud headed for the stairs and darted up them, with Barret and Red 13 close behind him. The room that stood directly above the kitchen was the main bedroom, and the 3 ran in through the open door. By then they were not surprised to see the cloaked figure standing there, shuffling aimlessly between the chest of drawers and the bed. On the floor there was a broken vase, knocked off by the cloaked man as he shuffled around. It was as though he didn't even know where he was going. This time Barret was the one to go to the man and lift up the sleeve, revealing the tattoo that was burned onto his arm.
Tattoo number 4,
Cloud said, reading the tattoo number aloud. He shared a glance with Barret, both of them wondering the same things. There was something with Nibelheim right then. Not only did the town exist when it should have just been a pile of ruin, but there were people claiming to have lived in the town all their lives, and strangely cloaked men wandering around that no one seemed to take any notice of. It was a very eerie event, and there was no explanation for it.
Where are you?
The man said.
Great. S.E. Phi. Roth.
Barret released the man, and the 3 left the main bedroom. These men seemed to be wandering around the whole of Nibelheim. Why did no one do anything about them? The last place left to check in the house was the final bedroom, Tifa's old bedroom. As Cloud, Barret, and Red 13 walked in they found that Tifa was already in the bedroom with Eris, Yuffie and Kat. Tifa was standing by the desk looking down at a piece of paper there, while Eris and Yuffie sat silently on the bed and Kat stood by the piano.
What is going on here?
Asked Eris, being the first to break the silence as they all gathered in the bedroom.
Everyone in this town is acting so strange. Something isn't right,
agreed Yuffie, lying back on the bed with her feet dangling in the air.
This place is so whack, let's move on already.
Cloud shook his head and leaned against the wall.
Not until we know what's going on,
he said.
None of this is right. This town should not be here, these people should not be here. I don't think any of the people here are likely to tell us anything,
said Red 13.
It is clear that they all know something, I can smell the anxiety when they are confronted by us. Cloud.
Everyone looked up as Tifa turned away from the desk, holding the sheet of paper in her hands. She held it out to Cloud, who took it and read it quickly through once, before he read it again out loud. Periodic report to Professor Hojo. 1 Clone activity report. Unfortunately, no clones have left this town this quarter. As previously reported, the clones seem to be sensing something. But all they say is, reunion or Sephiroth, and show no other signs of activity. 2 Confidentiality report. A total of 8 people have visited this town this quarter. Fortunately, none knew about the incident 5 years ago. Therefore, no one knows that the town was restored exactly as it was 5 years ago. Our staff, disguised as townspeople, have improved their acting skills, and we do not report any problems at this time. That is all. When Cloud finished reading the report, he scrunched it up angrily in his hands and threw it across the room towards the waste paper basket by the window. It hit the wall and fell to the floor, missing the basket and lying in a crumpled heap alongside it. For a moment no one bothered to pick it up, until Cloud walked over to it and threw it into the bin, and then standing by the window to look out at the town. At least it all made sense now. The incident 5 years ago would have been a big blow to Shinra's reputation, so they would have had to cover it up somehow. With all the residents killed in the fire, they would have no problem rebuilding the town as it was before, and hire people to act as residents until normal people chose to move into the town and take over naturally. The only thing that didn't make sense was the cloaked men, or clones. What, or who, were they meant to be clones of, and what was their purpose? He presumed now that the numbers on their arms were their code signs, showing just how many clones there were. How many were there? Clone number 11 was down in the kitchen, so there were at least 11 clones in Nibelheim. How many more were there and who was controlling them? One thing was for sure, they weren't acting completely of their own will. He was so busy thinking that he ignored the rest of the conversation going on behind him as the others planned what to do next. The only way forward was through Mount Nebel, but the paths were so rugged in there that they would never support the buggy. That meant that they had no choice but to abandon the buggy and continue their journey on foot.
Cloud,
said Cat, bounding up behind him and giving him a pat on the shoulder with his megaphone.
We're ready to go.
Cloud turned and nodded. He followed the others out of the room and down the stairs, passing the other clones still wandering around downstairs and stepping out into the quiet Nibelheim streets again. They moved quickly on, heading further north to reach the exit of the town. Nibelheim was too much of a ghost town now, there was nothing homely or warm about it anymore. They wanted to move on and leave Nibelheim behind, leaving it as another memory. The Shinra mansion was the last building in Nibelheim they had to pass. That was the only original building left in Nibelheim, and stood the same as it always did. The rusty gates were still open, and the building itself still looked just as creepy as before. The group had intended on passing the mansion without a second thought, but they were forced to stop as they saw two more of the cloaked clones standing in the middle of the path, facing the mansion. They seemed more agitated than all the other clones, their voices high-pitched and wailing mournfully as they approached.
Whoa!
The first of the clones wailed, his voice twisted and uncontrolled.
He's calling. Sephiroth is calling.
That caught everyone's attention. The group stopped beside the clone and listened to the clone as he subsided again into mindless muttering. Sephiroth was calling? They listened closely to the air, but they could not hear anything but silence and the heavy breathing of the clones.
The Great S.E. Phi Roth is near.
The other clone then said, his arms wavering shakily in front of him as though he was trying to grab something.
Inside the mansion. The Great Sephi Roth.
Cloud and Tifa spared enough time to look at each other for a quick second, before they both suddenly turned and ran towards the open gates of the mansion. The others were close behind, running through the gates towards the closed doors of the mansion where Sephiroth awaited. End of chapter. Episode 8, Part 06, Chapter 08. Chapter 8. The old wooden doors of Shinra Mansion burst open, with such force that they flew back and crashed against the inside walls of the mansion. The sound of the crash echoed throughout the main hall, which was exactly the same as it was 5 years ago apart from an increase in the amount of dust in the air. In the doorway stood Cloud and the others, the light outside silhouetting their bodies so that their shadows fell on the ground, stretched so they reached deep inside the hall. The hall was still as dark as ever, reminding Cloud of the first time he had stepped foot in the mansion. The curtains on the back windows were still drawn although they were falling apart, their structure disintegrating from the constant sunlight from outside. It wouldn't be long before they fell apart completely, letting the sunlight shine freely onto the oak floorboards. Another thing that had not changed was the sense of unease, a sure sign that told him that Sephiroth was indeed somewhere within the mansion. The air was cold, as though something powerful and menacing had stepped through it and chilled the very air itself. And that could only be Sephiroth. Together the group stepped past the doors and into the mansion. The floorboards creaked loudly underneath 5 pairs of heavy boots and 1 pair of stuffed mechanical feet, plus the pattering of Red 13's paws. They echoed, too, joining the fading echo of the door crash. They were making no effort at being silent. They wanted Sephiroth to know that they were here, and they wanted him to prepare himself. Once they were all inside the mansion, Barrett and Cat worked together to close the old doors. They seemed to creak even louder as they slid slowly shut, creating a small faint bang as they connected and shut out the sunlight, leaving the hall in darkness apart from the single beam of light that shone in through the half-covered windows. With the doors shut, Cloud walked forward, walking to the very center of the hall. He then stopped and looked around at the hall. There was no sign of Sephiroth, but he knew that he was somewhere within the mansion's ghostly walls. They would have no choice but to search the house room by room, and hope that no monsters had taken refuge within it. He was about to walk forward to the old door leading into the back corridor, when Tifa suddenly said his name. She was standing in the corner of the hall, at an open doorway leading into a tiny side room. Eris was beside her, and together they were looking at a small piece of paper that had gone yellow with age and was thick with dust. Tifa held out the paper to Cloud, and he looked down at it. It certainly was a very old sheet of paper. The writing was scribbled very roughly and he could barely read it because of the dust. He blew on it, blowing carefully so as not to damage the paper, for it was very frail indeed. Thankfully it didn't fall apart in his hands, and with more of the dust gone he could read what was on the sheet. I must get rid of all those that stand in the way of my research. Even that one from the Turks. I scientifically altered him, and put him to sleep in the basement. If you want to find him, then search the area. But this is merely a game I thought of. It is not necessary for you to participate if you don't want to. Move the dial of the safe carefully, but quickly. You have 20 seconds. You cannot go past the numbers while turning. The 4 hints for the numbers are: Dial 1, the lid of the box with the most oxygen. Dial 2, behind the ivories short of T and Ray. Dial 3, the creak in the floor near the chair on the second floor. Then to the left 5 steps, up 9 steps, left 2 steps and up 6 steps. When he had finished reading the contents of the yellowed out letter, Cloud looked up at Tifa and Eris and raised an eyebrow blankly.
So?
He said, sounding a little unimpressed by its contents.
What about it? It's just an old letter.
Eris shook her head fiercely, her green eyes looking at Cloud in earnest.
Didn't you read it properly, Cloud?
She asked him.
There's someone trapped inside this mansion. We have to help them. What you're talking about?
Barrett snapped angrily, his voice reverberating off the walls and the echo of his pounding feet sounding down the corridors. Not that he cared.
We're going after Sephiroth, not playing a game of hide and seek. I know that,
Eris replied. She turned away for a moment, taking a breath to compose her feelings. After those few moments had passed she turned back and looked around at everyone around her.
I'm sorry. I just can't go on knowing that someone is trapped and needs our help. I know this isn't the time to do this, but...
She looked at Tifa.
Tifa.
Tifa looked back at her. She seemed as unsure as the others, but when she saw the look on Eris's face, she realized that she felt the same.
We should help them,
she said finally, turning her gaze firmly on Cloud. One by one, Cloud felt everyone's gazes turn to him, waiting for a decision. Cloud slowly passed his eyes over each of them, analyzing their expressions. Everyone seemed to be in agreement on the idea, nodding slightly as he looked at them. Everyone except Barrett, that is, who turned away stubbornly with his arms folded and his foot tapping impatiently on the floor. Even though he wasn't looking, he seemed to know the unanimous decision of the others, and growled fiercely.
Do whatever you want.
He snapped. Cloud sighed heavily and shook his head, while Tifa stifled a giggle under her breath. They were both secretly amused by Barrett's apparent stubbornness, although they both knew that deep down he was in agreement over their decision. Eris was right, they couldn't leave someone trapped inside the mansion. Half an hour later the group were all gathered on the second floor of the mansion, inside one of the side rooms on the left side of the house. It was just opposite the bedrooms, and it was the only room in the entire house that had a safe inside. At that very moment Cloud was on his knees, preparing to input the 4 codes into the timed lock that kept the safe shut. It had been no easy trick getting the codes. The clues had been very vague and hard to understand, but eventually they solved the riddles and found the numbers. The first clue had been on the ground floor in the side room opposite where they had found the letter, written on the lid of a box beside a large group of plants. The second clue had been a little more difficult. The closest thing that came to ivory was the old ivory piano on the ground floor. There was also a table in that particular room, along with a window where sunlight shone in, stopping just near the end of the piano. Sure enough, written on the floor behind the piano in rough figures was the next dial number. The third turned out to be easier than it first appeared. There were not many chairs on the second floor, and finding one with a creak in the floorboard was easy. It took them a few attempts, but following the directions correctly led them to the third dial number, also scrawled on the floor. At first they thought that was it, until they returned to the safe room and read the letter again. According to the letter, there were 4 numbers needed to break the safe, but the letter only showed 3 clues. Upon closer inspection they noticed that there was more writing underneath the 3rd clue, but it was very faint and deliberately worn out so that it was nigh on impossible to see. They all had a go at trying to read the number written there. It was Red 13 who solved it after Tifa snatched the sheet away from Barrett, who had threatened to rip it up out of sheer rage and fury. So now they had their 4 numbers, and Cloud prepared to put them into the safe.
I have a bad feeling about this,
he said aloud as he touched the safe. There was a strong hidden power resonating within the thick layers of metal that kept it secure. He could feel it as he touched it, a power of rage and strength. He glanced back at the others. They were all stood behind him in a single line, their weapons and materia ready for anything that emerged from the safe. They could all sense the power raging within the safe as it resonated around the room as well, so they were all prepared for an instant strike if anything hostile were to emerge. They nodded at Cloud, who nodded back and turned to the safe. In the deadly silence that followed, Cloud began to input the numbers into the safe. According to the letter, they had only 20 seconds in which to input the numbers, so he needed perfect silence in order to get the numbers in. The dial began to turn, the faint clicks echoing very softly in the room. As Cloud hit the first number, right 36, a slightly louder click could be heard. Instantly Cloud began to twist the dial the other way towards the second number. Exact precision was needed to crack the safe, and the pressure made his heart beat rapidly in his chest and in his ears, drowning out the sound of the clicks.
Left 10.
Click.
Right 59.
Click. There were only a few seconds left on the timer, and Cloud could feel the rage contained within the safe growing as he began to turn the dial towards the last number, the one that would unlock the safe.
Right 97.
A loud click filled the room as the safe unlocked. Cloud stood up, grabbing the door of the safe and pulling it open, exposing the inside of the safe. As the safe door opened, a loud screeching roar filled the room, followed by a cloud of steam that surrounded the safe and seeped across the floor like a liquid, curling like tendrils across the wood. The rest of the group stood waiting as the steam continued to thicken, waiting for the creature to emerge. Slowly and steadily, the monster began to emerge from the safe. Its body made a sickened squishing and bone-crunching sound as it squeezed out of the safe. It stamped one thick blue and green foot onto the floor, followed by a squishy red and yellow tentacle that moved of its own will across the floor like antennae searching for food. It then stepped out of the steam and into full view of the group awaiting it. It was a very misshapen creature, probably forged from a combination of different levels of Mako energy. Its body was composed of 2 parts, split completely in half and joined together by squishy flesh. The left-hand side of its body was entirely physical, with a firm body made up of a large rock-shaped head and a fierce yellow eye. Its leg and its arm were incredibly muscular and firm, covered in the same tough blue skin and tipped with sharp claws that made it an arsenal of physical destruction. The right-hand side of the creature was entirely the opposite. Its firm flesh was replaced by soft, almost fiery-looking skin, for it was burned a bright red. Many long tentacles like heavy eyebrows shielded most of its face, sweeping to the side like flames. Tentacles made up its arm and leg, each of them wavering around in search of prey, making it a weapon of magical force. Yet despite all these differences, the creature's menacing grin was one long smile, tipped with razor-sharp teeth.
Now!
Cloud shouted from beside the safe. On his command, Barrett and all the others released the power of their materia in one powerful strike towards the creature. Large blasts of fire and ice stormed through the air and struck the blue half of the creature right in its face. It convulsed and screeched loudly, the magical energies burning through its weak magical defense. It cried out more as 2 blasts of dark energy merged around it, shrinking its body and then expanding it. That was enough. As the flames and ice swept around it, the creature shuddered, and the blue half exploded with a sudden poof of steam that filled the air. That left only the red half, the magical half, behind.
Quickly! Before it reforms!
Came Cloud's voice from behind as he saw the faint tinges of more red flesh begin to emerge from the creature's side. The body was already half grown as the second attack came. The new red flesh that made up the rest of the magical half's body was blown to shreds as bullets poured in from ahead, piercing through the newly formed flesh with ease. As the bullets stopped, then came the second part of the attack as Yuffie, Tifa, and Kat ran forward together. Yuffie sliced with her shuriken while Kat used his megaphone to pound through the wounded flesh, making the impact of Yuffie's slashes much more devastating. Tifa worked alongside him, her punches forcing the wounds to grow. They stepped back the moment the creature began to shudder. The magical creature's body twisted and convulsed, its tentacles out of control as they whipped around the room. A deep red glow began to burn in the center of the creature, growing and growing until it enveloped the entire creature. Then, with a loud pop, the creature burst into flames and disintegrated in seconds, the steam from its body rising and dispersing into the air. With the creature gone, the steam quickly began to clear. The sound died away too, leaving the room in silence again. No one moved until the steam had fully cleared, leaving only the open door of the safe behind it. The creature had been easy to defeat, but only because it had been locked away in the safe for so long. It had weakened after so many years, making it a cinch to defeat. Cloud moved round from the side of the safe and peered into the dark doorway. At first he thought it was empty, until he caught a glimpse of two objects hidden within the darkness. One was a key, the other was a ball of red summon materia. The materia of Odin, he soon realized, for hidden in its crystalline form was the faint image of a powerful lance that only the legendary Odin could bear.
"We've got it,"
he said to the others, picking up both the materia and the key he assumed to be the key to the basement. Shutting the safe door again, he turned to Tifa and Eris, both of whom looked very relieved.
"Let's go."
With the key in hand they left the safe room, now prepared to head down to the basement to rescue the person that was seemingly trapped inside the mansion. It was a lucky thing that they had to head into the dark basement, for that would be the most likely place where they would find Sephiroth, too. Cloud led the way through the mansion now, remembering the secret shaft in one of the second-floor rooms that led straight down into the basement, which he discovered when looking for Sephiroth the first time. Sure enough, it was still there, the stone shaft with its stonework that didn't quite match, slightly ajar as though someone had passed through and not shut it properly. It had to be Sephiroth, for there should have been no one else inside the mansion. He pulled the hidden door open with ease and peered down into the spiral staircase. It still made him feel a bit dizzy, looking down at the dark spirals heading deeper into shadows. He could still see the bottom, and a very faint glow of light there. With the others close behind him, he stepped into the shaft and began to lead the way down, one hand against the walls to steady himself. It was so silent in the shaft he could hear everyone's breath as they breathed nervously inside the shaft. There was a cold chill in the air and the faint scent of something living, and that made them nervous. It was a fairly foul scent, not nauseating, but enough to make them hold their noses in disgust as they continued to descend towards the bottom of the shaft. They found out what the smell came from once they reached the bottom of the staircase, and looked down at the floor. The smell came from various droplets of droppings that lined the floor here and there, something Cloud didn't remember. As they looked up, they saw the owners of the droppings, hanging from the walls and the ceiling by their claws, with their leathery wings wrapped firmly around their bodies. A few of the bats looked at Cloud and the others, a peculiar clicking noise coming from their mouths as they tried to see what they were.
"Bats,"
said Red 13, his keen eyes able to see the small, furry forms of the bats more clearly.
"This place has become a nesting ground for bats." "Let's move on," said Cloud, who was looking further down the tunnel. "Sephiroth is here somewhere. I can feel him." With that he headed down the tunnel, carefully dodging the various piles of bat droppings. The door to the hidden laboratory was very visible now, and a bright light was glowing through the edges of the door. He was about to walk straight up to that door and barge in, but before he could he suddenly stopped, feeling his fist clench around the hard thin form of metal he was holding in his hands. It was the basement key, and it surely wasn't for the laboratory. He suddenly remembered and looked to his left, towards the other door that he had only so briefly looked at 5 years ago. Back then it had still been locked, and it still was. The padlock that kept the door firmly shut was old but still strong, although it looked like the key would fit. He took one glance at the laboratory door and then at Tifa and Eris, before finally going to the other door and sliding the key into the lock. Sephiroth probably wasn't going anywhere right then. The door unlocked with ease, and opened a little as Cloud pulled the padlock free. He pushed it open and it creaked eerily, the sound of the creak echoing down the corridor. It made Cloud and all the others freeze, glancing back towards the laboratory to see if they had disturbed whoever it was inside, if it was indeed Sephiroth. Luckily there was no shift in the light, so they turned back to the door and headed inside. Once they were all in the room, Katshi shut the door behind them, leaving it only slightly ajar so they could hear if someone emerged from the laboratory outside. Then they looked around. As they looked around the room, they immediately thought the letter must have been some kind of horrible joke. There was no one in the small square room, but there were an awful lot of coffins. All of them were open, lying here and there, each one untouched with their lids lying abandoned beside them. There was only one coffin that was closed. It was not the grandest of coffins and was not properly sealed down like a used coffin should have been, but it was the only one that stood out. In the silence that followed they also realized that there were faint noises coming from inside that coffin.
Everyone immediately froze, their muscles tightening in fear, as the noises grew louder for a second, before subsiding back into faint mumbling again. It reminded Cloud of the clones outside, until he realized that these mumbles did not come from mindless ramblings, but rather the mumblings of someone in discomfort. It was Eris who plucked up the courage to move first. While the others stood frozen around her, she moved forward and stood at the edge of the coffin, looking down at the nameless lid that kept it down. She pressed her head against the side of the coffin and listened to the faint mumbles inside. They were definitely human and in clear discomfort. Carefully, she knocked on the side of the coffin and the mumbles stopped, and she was unaware of the person or creature that was slowly opening its eyes inside. She knocked again, and a voice spoke out from inside the coffin.
"To wake me from the nightmare,"
came the voice, deep and somewhat monotonous, lacking emotion. The lid of the coffin began to shift slightly, the dust sliding off.
"Who is it?"
As the voice spoke angrily, the lid of the coffin suddenly shook violently, causing Yuffie to scream and grasp onto Kat's mechanical Mog body for comfort. The coffin continued to shake, the golden clasps that kept the lid down bursting open until the lid was free. It flew off instantly, held by some powerful magical force that lifted it away from the coffin until it rested calmly on the floor. Everyone looked at the open coffin, adrenaline rushing through them as they looked at the figure lying inside. Slowly the figure began to sit up. He rose steadily from the waist up, his arms not moving, his head craned back in sleep. Once he was upright, he began to lift his head and gazed upon the group standing fearfully in front of him, his dark eyes looking at them wearily. He was certainly a very enigmatic-looking man. He looked to be in his late 20s, although the expression on his face made them think he was somewhat older. His skin was very pale, as though it had not seen sunlight for a long period of time, although there were still a few faint traces of color left. He also had a head of long black hair that was tied back, although he let a few long strips of fringe hang around his face. These were kept up by a red bandana tied around his head. He was dressed in a black tunic of sorts, which was mostly covered up by a long red cape that flowed around his shoulders and down his back. The cape had a large collar that shielded the lower half of his face, such as his mouth and chin. On his feet were a pair of knee-high boots over black trousers. What was most peculiar about the red-clad man was his left arm. While his right arm was normal and human-looking, his left arm was most certainly not. It was as though he had been given a different arm made of golden brown metal or very firm flesh, they couldn't tell which. It had many joints, especially at the fingers. Instead of normal fingers, this arm had longer, much more pointy fingers, as though they were claws made for attacking. The others all stared in awe and in fear at the man who had so mysteriously moved the coffin lid and sat up to gaze at them. He was a man locked in the bottom of a deep, dark basement, sleeping in an unmarked coffin away from the sunlight. They sincerely hoped that vampires were just legend. End of chapter. Episode 9, Part 06, Chapter 09. Chapter 9. The mysterious man sat in the coffin made no attempt to step out of the coffin once he had sat up. Instead, he chose to turn his gaze slowly from one person to another while his arms hung loosely by his sides. It was as though he had no life in the rest of his body, waking up just enough to sit and move his head. Upon closer inspection, it turned out his eyes were not dark but a very deep red, something that was very alluring and mystifying, and held their gazes as he looked at them.
"Never seen you before,"
he said to them. His voice was soft and very quiet, and almost unemotional. His lips, a soft red against his pale skin, barely moved as he spoke, as though he was still lost in a dream.
"You must leave." "You were having a nightmare,"
Cloud pointed out. He saw the man's head slowly turn and his gaze fell upon him, slowly looking him up and down. Cloud gazed back at him, doing the same. He seemed to be rather frail, but somehow he figured the man was much stronger than he appeared to be.
"How bad was your dream?"
asked Tifa. The man then turned his gaze on Tifa and looked her over. It was clear in his eyes that he was still in the process of waking up, and a little disorientated. Yet they also got the distinct impression that he was not the talkative type, and that he did not really want them there.
"Humph. A nightmare,"
he said, his voice becoming low and quiet as he sighed sleepily under his breath.
"My long sleep has given me time to atone." "What are you saying?"
said Cloud, confused as to what the man meant by long sleep. What kind of long sleep? Was he really? The man in the coffin sighed once again, although this time it seemed to be a little more annoyed rather than sleepy.
I have nothing to say to strangers, he replied, still keeping his level, unemotional tone as he spoke. Get out. This mansion is the beginning of your nightmare.
Cloud also sighed, and lowered his head so that he was looking at the dirty, dust-covered floor of the coffin chamber.
You can say that again,
he mumbled faintly, although in the silence of the room it was still loud enough for the man to hear.
What do you know?
Cloud looked up again and gazed at the man. He had his head tilted to the side so that his longer strips of fringe hung loosely across his pale face, staring at him through his deep red eyes. He almost looked a little interested in hearing what Cloud knew about the mansion.
Like you said, this mansion is the beginning of a nightmare.
Cloud stopped suddenly and lightly shook his head, disagreeing with his own statement.
No, it's not a dream, it's for real. Sephiroth has lost his mind. He found the secrets hidden in this mansion. Sephiroth!
The man snapped fiercely, making everyone in the room jump. It was the first sign of emotion the man had shown since he sat up. His dark red eyes seemed to light up and flare against his skin, while his lip curled into an expression of sudden anger as he glared out at Cloud. It even brought a little color to his cheeks and some life to his hands, as out of sight of the others his fists clenched tightly and trembled slightly, trying hard to conceal the emotion.
You know Sephiroth?
Cloud and the man had asked the question at the exact same time. They stared intently at one another, each of them waiting for the other to speak and explain what they knew. Yet neither of them said anything, and continued to wait. Suddenly the man stood up and flipped out of the coffin, so suddenly in fact that it made the others jump in their anxiety, so tense that anything would make them jump. They watched as the man flipped up, almost seeming to move in slow motion before finally landing daintily on the edge of the coffin, his boots balanced perfectly on the thin wooden wall that kept it confined. Once he had landed and was steady, he pointed at Cloud sternly.
You start first, he said.
He made it sound almost like an order. Cloud took a deep breath and then began to explain in brief detail everything that he knew about Sephiroth. He kept it as brief as he possibly could, which was difficult since there was a lot to get through. He began 5 years ago, when he and Sephiroth first arrived in Nibelheim. This was the part that interested the man the most, hearing about everything that had happened while he slept within the walls of the mansion, unaware of everything. Cloud then moved on to the more recent events, beginning from the moment Sephiroth appeared inside Shinra headquarters and murdered the former Shinra president. He explained their pursuit of Sephiroth across the Midgar and Choco plains, the slaughter of the Midgar Zalem, and how he appeared on the Junon ship. All the while he explained, the mysterious caped man stood firmly on the edge of his coffin and listened intently to Cloud's story. His expression changed a number of times during the telling of the story, beginning with interest and then anger, before slowly turning into a sad and almost subdued look, as though a whole load of pain was hurled at him all at once.
That's how it was,
Cloud said when he had finally finished his story. He took a deep breath, relieved that it was over. He was beginning to feel like a recorder stuck on repeat, telling the same story over and over again. He looked up at the man, who had lowered his head to look at the floor. He had his arms folded now, deeply lost in many thoughts that were running through his head. The unemotional look had returned to his face now as he thought over what Cloud had said, making it impossible for them to see what he was thinking.
So Sephiroth knows he was created 5 years ago,
he said finally, still refusing to look at the group and continuing to look at the floor.
And about the Genova project? He was missing, but has just recently reappeared? He is taking many lives and is seeking the promised land.
Cloud nodded. He had just about got the gist of the situation. He then remembered that the man also had a story to tell.
Now it's your turn,
he said, just as sternly. He expected the caped man to comply and begin telling them his story, but to his surprise the man looked up at him through empty red eyes and slowly shook his head.
Sorry,
he said, shaking his head.
I cannot speak. I'm disappointed,
said Tifa. Around her the others all nodded in agreement. They had been rather looking forward to hearing the story of this strange man. Ignoring the groans of disappointment from the others, the caped man jumped smoothly into the air, flipping back so that his feet landed on the red velvet bedding of the coffin.
Hearing your stories has added upon me yet another sin,
he said. He suddenly sounded very sad and remorseful, and could not hold their gazes any longer.
More nightmares shall come to me now, more than I previously had.
He carefully sat back down in the coffin, his body fitting perfectly into the grooves that had formed naturally over time. He looked up and gave them one final look, before looking back down into the coffin.
Now, please leave.
Those were his last words, and as he lay back down inside the coffin, the lid rose up from the floor and lowered itself perfectly over the coffin. As the wooden lid slid back into place, the metal latches locked themselves together, sealing the coffin once more. There were no sounds inside the coffin, either. Silence descended upon the room again, and Cloud turned to look around at the others. They were all very confused by the man's sudden response and desire for them to leave without an explanation. What was his connection to Sephiroth, and why did their stories of him make him feel guilty? They were still curious to know what it was, and they didn't come all the way down into the basement just for him to shoo them away. Turning back, Cloud nodded to Eris. The young woman nodded back, and with the end of her staff she gave the coffin a harder and much louder knock. At first nothing happened, but as Eris was about to give it another gentle bash, the clasps unlocked themselves and the lid flew off once again. The man sat up again, sighing heavily as he saw the group still standing in front of the coffin.
"You're still here?"
he asked. Cloud nodded.
"Who are you?"
he asked, feeling they had at least spoken enough to know one another's names.
"At least tell us your name."
The dark-haired man hesitated for a quick second. He seemed rather reluctant to tell them anything about him, even something as simple but yet so personal as his name. He finally made up his mind and looked up at them, glancing from one person to another, and said,
"I was with the Shinra Manufacturing Department in Administrative Research, the Turks." "Vincent?" "The Turks?"
Cloud exclaimed, unable to hide the surprise from his voice. His eyes opened wide, and he could sense the others all taking a step back and putting their hands close to their weapons, perhaps unnecessarily. If this man was a member of the Turks, then he was definitely far stronger than he appeared on first glance. This was the first time Cloud had heard the true title of the Turks for a long, long time. The department had once only helped in research, often working alongside the science department in gathering specimens and guarding them. Of course that all changed a number of years ago, turning the Turks into what they were now, ruthless people who would go to any length to achieve their goal, ignoring all that got in their way.
"Formerly of the Turks,"
the man known as Vincent said. There was a faint sense of hostility in his voice as he stressed the word formerly, as though it was something he wanted to make clear.
"I have no affiliation with Shinra now." "And you?" "Cloud, formerly of Soldier."
Vincent raised an eyebrow in intrigue.
"You were also with Shinra?"
he asked. He seemed to hesitate again for a moment before asking,
"Then do you know Lucretia?"
There was a faint touch of hope in his voice and in his eyes as he waited for Cloud's answer.
"Who?"
Cloud asked. The hope in Vincent's eyes died, but he repeated the name anyway.
"Lucretia."
He watched as Cloud thought hard for a moment, but he was not surprised when Cloud regretfully shook his head, unable to recall the name at all.
"The woman who gave birth to Sephiroth."
Hearing that made Cloud very confused. If this Lucretia had given birth to Sephiroth, then technically she would be his mother. Yet all the reports written about the Genova project declared that Genova was Sephiroth's mother, and Sephiroth believed that without question. Cloud blinked at Vincent, the confusion clear on his face.
"Gave birth,"
he said.
"Wasn't Genova Sephiroth's mother?" "That isn't completely wrong, but just a theory,"
Vincent replied.
"He was born from a beautiful lady. That lady was Lucretia. She was an assistant to Professor Gast of the Genova project. Beautiful. Lucretia. A human experiment,"
said Cloud, staring. He was learning more and more about Sephiroth from Vincent's words. This Lucretia was his biological mother, and in another way, so was Genova. It was true that scientists were willing to go to almost any lengths in order to achieve what they wanted. It was also the second time in his life he had heard Professor Gast's name being mentioned. Sephiroth had mentioned it, too, when he had been pacing in the mansion after reading all those reports about the Genova project. Cloud remembered from Sephiroth's words that Professor Gast had been in charge of the Genova project, the one in charge of creating Sephiroth in the first place. If Lucretia had been his assistant, then that could mean only one thing.
"A human experiment,"
Cloud said, feeling a little disgusted.
"There was no way to cancel the experiment,"
Vincent continued. The sad and mournful look had returned to his deep red eyes as he thought back, images of beautiful Lucretia flashing across his memory.
"I couldn't stop her. That was my sin. I let the one I loved, the one I respected the most, face the worst. So the punishment was sleep,"
said Tifa, piecing together the rest of the story. Vincent nodded his head in reply, and Tifa scratched the back of her head in bewilderment.
That's weird.
She had heard of many different punishments in her time, but this was the first time she had heard of sleep as a punishment. Before she could say anything else, the man called Vincent slowly let his body sink back into the velvet-cushioned coffin, and the lid floated back into place. For a moment there was silence, until a faint, saddened voice murmured from inside the coffin, "Let me sleep," before returning to silence once again. One by one Cloud and the others quietly turned around and left the chamber and its gathering of empty coffins. It was clear that Vincent was not about to say any more to them, so they felt that this was the right time to leave him alone and continue his everlasting slumber. They even shut the door behind them, closing it so that the chamber was once again shut off from the rest of the world, the old key still resting in the rusty old lock. Hearing Vincent's story left them feeling a little subdued as they headed back towards the spiral staircase. It was yet another reminder of all the pain and suffering that Shinra had caused, all in the name of money and power. Power over those less fortunate, or weak-minded. Shinra was a plague that had spread across the planet, affecting everyone and everything in its path without a single care.
Wait.
Cloud and his group all stopped and turned around. As they turned, the door of the coffin chamber was suddenly pulled open, and Vincent came running out of the door. He looked around for a moment before he spotted them and ran over to them, a strangely determined look on his face. His cape flowed slowly and almost mysteriously behind him. Cloud also took note of a second belt that was tied around his waist, holding a slender black gun.
"If I go with you, will I meet Hojo?"
Vincent asked suddenly, before anyone could speak and interrupt him. Cloud shrugged his shoulders, surprised at the suddenness of the question.
"Dunno,"
he admitted.
"But we're after him and Sephiroth. So, I guess sooner or later."
He left the sentence hanging. Vincent let his eyes turn away, thinking Cloud's words over. As his suppressed memories rose, he quickly turned away, picturing in his mind the beautiful face that was Lucretia.
"Lucretia,"
he whispered under his breath. When he had finished his moment of remembrance, and had pushed the memories back down to where they could not be seen, he turned back to the others. His mind was made up, so he took a breath and said,
"All right, I've decided to go with you."
The suddenness of the statement caught everyone by surprise. The surprise was clear on their faces, their eyes open wide as they stared at him. All except Cloud, that is, whose expression was blank as he gazed at Vincent.
"What? You're coming with us?"
Tifa asked him. Vincent nodded at her, his determination resolute.
"Being a former Turks, I may be of help to you,"
he said. While all this was going on, Cloud was staring at Vincent. He was trying to figure out what was going on in the man's head, but his eyes weren't giving anything away. They were almost blank, despite their calming red color, and Cloud could not tell anything about him, unlike the others. The eyes of the others were filled with anger, fear, and sometimes a little uncertainty. Vincent's eyes were neither angry nor scared, but there was just a tiny bit of hidden sadness that could only be seen through careful examination. Yet as Vincent raised his gaze and met Cloud's eyes, he saw a strong pang of sudden determination, and Cloud smiled.
"All right, then,"
he said, with a slight nod. Vincent nodded back at him in gratitude, one hand resting quietly over the handle of his gun. Even with the arrival of a new member to the group, there were no joyful or overly dramatic welcomes. Perhaps it was because Vincent was not the type of person to neither accept nor enjoy such welcomes, or maybe it was simply because the atmosphere and the aura of the deeper depths of the mansion repressed all those kinds of reactions. So instead, after a brief but meaningful welcome, of which the most excited was Kat, glad that he was no longer the newest, the group of what was now 8 finally began to head back towards the spiral staircase, relieved that all their efforts to find Vincent had at least paid off. Cloud was at the back of the group as they headed back slowly down the tunnel, avoiding the areas where the bats had been. He didn't mind a new member joining their journey. After all, Vincent also had a strong reason to fight Sephiroth, and he had no reason to lie to them. Remembering Sephiroth made Cloud stop with a sudden jolt, although the others didn't notice this and carried on towards the stairs. Cloud almost slapped himself across the face, how could he have forgotten that so easily? He turned around slowly and looked back towards the door of the underground laboratory. His heart was beating loudly as he looked, although he didn't know why he was afraid to look. Was he afraid that the door would be dark and locked, and that they had missed their chance to fight Sephiroth? Or was he more afraid to see the light still there, and that Sephiroth could still be inside waiting for them? So as he turned his faintly glowing blue eyes, he prepared himself for what he would see. Even so, the sense of fear and relief that licked its way down his spine as he saw the door still ajar with the thin line of light shining through made him jolt again. So Sephiroth could still be inside. With his heart still beating loudly inside his chest, Cloud took a step forward towards the door. He didn't call out to the others, who were now heading up the stairs, leaving him alone in the tunnel. Careful step by careful step, Cloud walked slowly towards the partly open door. His eyes stared solidly at the door, his gaze focused completely for any signs of movement beyond the door, even if it was just a flickering of the light. He paused outside the door, hesitant to step inside. He knew he should call the others, but by now they would be at the top of the stairs and out of his calling range. So he was alone outside the laboratory, unaware that his hand was automatically moving towards the handle like a puppet being pulled by string. The door opened with a light creak, and more light swept out and into the tunnel. Before his eyes had time to adjust, Cloud found himself walking into the laboratory, leaving the door open behind him. Despite his anxiety, his hand didn't move towards his sword or any of his materia, instead choosing to hang awkwardly by his waist, almost like a lost part. Looking around, Cloud saw that the laboratory hadn't changed much in the past 5 years. The piles of books that were gathered around the bookcases were still there, untouched, with even more dust gathering on the leather covers and thin paper pages. The desk was exactly as it had been left, along with the filthy old tubes in the corner. Cloud still wondered what they were for. Cloud stopped in the middle of the laboratory and slowly turned his head towards the corridor that continued the library, towards the office. He was not surprised when he found another pair of slightly glowing eyes staring back at him. Cloud felt his mouth fall open a little, but the feeling was distant, and almost unreal. Sephiroth was standing in the middle of the corridor again, his head also turned to look back at Cloud with a faint but sinister grin on his face. It was not the grin but the cold glare of his eyes that made Cloud freeze, the glare piercing him like a knife. A full minute passed by as Cloud and Sephiroth stared at one another, neither one of them speaking. Looking at Sephiroth standing there with that grin on his face, Cloud began to feel the deep rage he felt for the older man beginning to swell in him. At first it was just normal anger, but the longer he gazed into Sephiroth's eyes the harder it became for him to control, as though someone had flicked off the safety switch. Pretty soon he found his voice and his movement again, and he turned towards the man with a furious glare in his eyes.
Sephiroth!
The corner of Sephiroth's mouth twitched and spread into something more worthy of being considered a sinister smile. It made Cloud step back like a silent command, and he fell silent. Sephiroth, on the other hand, was free to move as he lifted his gaze and looked around at the library walls around him.
Being here brings back memories,
he said, his voice so soft and almost gentle that it didn't even echo off the walls. After looking around he looked back at Cloud, curious.
Are you going to participate in the reunion? I don't even know what a reunion is.
Cloud snapped. His hand was twitching to move to his sword, but the longer he stared at Sephiroth the harder it became for him to move his hand to it.
Genova will be at the reunion,
Sephiroth continued, seemingly unaware of Cloud's inability to draw his sword. Instead, he returned to gazing at the walls of books and the secrets they held within them.
Genova will join the reunion, becoming a calamity from the skies.
All at once, Cloud stopped and stared at Sephiroth. He didn't move nor breathe, and his hand was no longer twitching.
Genova,
he said slowly, his voice sounding awkward.
A calamity from the skies? I thought she was an ancient.
Sephiroth suddenly snapped his head around and locked gazes with Cloud, feeling the younger male's abrupt jerk as their eyes met. There was no recognition of the words in his eyes. In fact, he was completely clueless, and Sephiroth frowned.
I see,
he said finally, his voice empty and emotionless as he spoke.
I don't think you have the right to participate.
He reached up and flicked back his silver hair, while his other hand remained on the hilt of his sword. He looked away in thought for a moment, before a faint flicker of a smile returned to his face.
I will go north past Mount Nebel,
he said.
If you wish to find out, then follow. Reunion.
Cloud repeated, lost in Sephiroth's words.
Calamity from the skies.
While Cloud was busy contemplating what Sephiroth had said, Sephiroth suddenly reached under his cloak and pulled out a small, rounded ball of green materia, and threw it at Cloud. Cloud didn't even have time to look up before it hit him, and he curled over and fell to his knees, groaning loudly as he clutched his waist, the ball of materia rolling in front of him. With Cloud temporarily distracted, Sephiroth floated up away from the floor and flew forward. All Cloud could see through his tear-filled eyes was Sephiroth's shadow as he passed over him and flew out of the laboratory door, disappearing down the tunnel. Once the pain began to subside, Cloud slowly staggered to his feet, picking up the materia as he moved. His sword felt heavy on his back, so he untied the strap that held it up and let the large blade fall weakly onto the ground. The materia attached to the sword also came loose and scattered across the floor, and the ball in Cloud's hands fell down as he lost his grip, joining the rest of the Mako balls in a scattered scurry across the floor. Cloud didn't notice, nor did he care. He just stood there, breathing heavily, head lowered so that the longer lengths of his blonde hair cast dark shadows across his eyes and they could hardly be seen. The cold feeling of fear and a slight, aching pain in the back of his head were all he could feel, apart from the cold fingers of the memory of Sephiroth that were still closing around him, even after Sephiroth had left. End of chapter. Episode 10, Part 06, Chapter 10. Chapter 10. Traveling through the rough and jagged peaks of Mount Nebel was thought to be no problem for Cloud and his team. The paths were too bumpy for the buggy, so they'd had no choice but to abandon it outside Nibelheim. The acting shopkeeper didn't have many items to sell, but they had managed to stock up on food and healing items for the next part of their journey. The mountains themselves had seemed quiet enough. They were just as Cloud had remembered them, too. The rocky cliffs were still grey and lifeless. The air was still cold and dry, and the winding mist that still lay heavy across the mountain floor made him feel uneasy and apprehensive. He had no doubt the others felt the same. Mount Nebel wasn't a very hospitable place at any time. They had soon discovered how inhospitable as they finished crossing the old wooden bridge that joined the two main mountains. They had barely even taken a few steps away from the bridge when a piercing screech came screaming down at them from the rising grey walls, making them stop and look up, their hands rushing towards their weapons. Glaring back down at them had been a giant scorpion-like beast that lived inside the deepest crevices of Mount Nebel. The Materia Keeper was perfectly adapted to its terrain. It had a body of thick, dark blue skin that was so tough it was almost impossible to penetrate with ordinary weapons. It had 4 strong legs tipped with gigantic claws for digging into rock, and 2 more back legs raised up to grip into the crevices of the mountain wall. Behind it were a long, spiked tail and a flexible rod of firm flesh, making it a walking arsenal of spikes and claws. And with all that thick flesh and claws, defeating it would certainly be no easy task. They couldn't believe how right they had been. With the Materia Keeper's tough flesh, their weapons were proving next to useless. Not a single one had made a dent in the monster's flesh, not even Barrett's bullets, firing at 3 to 5 bullets a second. Nor could they afford to get too close to the creature. That spiked tail and many claws were just waiting to grab onto them and slice them in half. So, with all these handicaps in place, they had resorted to falling back on their last remaining weapons. Weapons that would prove to be the backbone and motivation for all of their battles to come, the Materia. A single red ball was thrown up into the air and it shimmered brilliantly with an intense blue-white color. Within seconds the shimmer had grown and solidified, bringing forth the form of a beautiful ice maiden contained within the ball. Her skin was iridescent, shimmering with many shades of blue like images reflecting off the surface of lightly rippling water. Her eyes were a deep, enchanting blue but held tremendous power, which only intensified as she floated down from the air to the spot in front of the Materia Keeper. Shiva, the Maiden of Eternal Cold, slowly raised her right arm up above her head. A shower of icy sparkles began to glisten in the air as a blue ball of light formed at the tip of her fingers. When she was ready, Shiva lowered her arm and cast the ball away from her. The Materia Keeper never had the chance to react. It was still reeling from the fierce storm of flames that were burning around its tough skin, cast by Ifrit in the previous attack. Yet, although the flames were strong, they were nowhere near powerful enough to damage the beast. Its strength against heat was incredible. As Shiva's attack hit, those flames were vanquished instantly, replaced by a structure of strong, slanted icicles. The Materia Keeper shuddered and then stilled within the icy frame, until the icicles shattered and Shiva disappeared in a shower of sparkles. With the icy cage now gone, the Materia Keeper screeched and charged forward, its legs slicing up huge chunks of rock as it stomped forward like a charging cannon. It headed towards Yuffie and Eris, who were standing cornered at the edge of the cliff overlooking the chasm. Yuffie, furious at the thought of being cornered, leapt up from the sidelines and prepared to throw her shuriken. The Materia Keeper stopped and raised one of its powerful, claw-tipped feet and struck the girl in mid-leap, swiping her aside. The young ninja hit the ground hard and rolled across the floor, hitting one of the exhaust pipes that were sticking up out of the ground. Ignoring the pelting parade of bullets that were attacking it from behind, the Materia Keeper then turned towards Eris. She was already preparing her defense, her staff hovering in front of her as she began to cast the magic from her own materia. A swirling pool of black emptiness was forming in front of her, rippling like water. The Materia Keeper raised its sharp-clawed, pincer-like leg and thrust it forward. The pincers touched the edge of the pool and quivered, a sharp swell spreading across the hard claws and spreading to the monster's skin. Pulled deeper into the pool by the gravitational, the claw began to shrink and twist, its form being completely distorted by the field. Alas, keeping the gravitational field going was extremely difficult, and Eris was already struggling. Her hands trembled as she held them out in front of her, and the black pool was steadily beginning to draw back towards her as the Materia Keeper began to push it back. She closed her eyes and focused all of her energy on keeping the magic working to save her from falling from the ledge. Still, as the Materia Keeper pushed, the wall kept falling back and rippling harder, close to breaking despite Eris's attempts. A few seconds later the wall shuddered, before dissolving into a dozen droplets of black that slowly melted away into the air, leaving Eris defenseless. As the Materia Keeper thrust its leg forward, it stopped as another pool of black suddenly appeared ahead of it, blocking its attack again. Eris looked over to her right and saw Catchy standing nearby, the materia in his megaphone twinkling vibrantly. "Cat!" she called. The cat didn't answer her, as his attention was entirely focused on keeping up the gravitational pull that was stopping the Materia Keeper from getting near to her. So far it was working, and the Materia Keeper was temporarily held still against its strong pull. Using this moment of immobility to their advantage, the others chose this moment to attack. Barrett, Cloud, and Tifa cast a series of fire, ice and lightning attacks into the air, and a blur of fiery fur dashed alongside the monster. In his wake Red 13 created a series of cuts and scratches across the monster's skin, although they were not very damaging wounds and did not slow the monster in any way. As if to prove this point, the Materia Keeper stepped back and broke away from the gravity field cast by Catchy. It stomped its legs into the rock as it turned around sharply so that it was facing Red 13 as he ran past. In a rage of fury, the Materia Keeper lowered its head and charged forward. Red 13 jumped up as the Materia Keeper thrust the deadly horn on the front of its face forward, and yelped as he felt the hot sting scrape the side of his hind legs. As the hound landed and staggered out of the way, Cloud suddenly zipped past and darted along the edge of the ledge, just as the Materia Keeper began to turn once again. He grabbed Eris as he ran past, pulling her away from the edge just as the long, spiked tail of the Materia Keeper swung past them, missing them by a few inches. As the Materia Keeper finished turning, it spotted the two running away from it, and once again began to charge towards them. With its deadly claws raised it struck, but was stopped, as a flash of red appeared in front of it, and something golden-brown came up and caught the claws in mid-descent. Hearing the frustrated cry of the monster, Cloud and Eris stopped and looked back. The Materia Keeper had been stopped by Vincent, his left arm stopping the claws in their tracks. Vincent stood his ground as the monster pushed against him, not showing a single ounce of pain on his face as the claw dug into the golden plating surrounding his arm. With the monster directly in front of him, Vincent flung open his cape with his free hand and pulled out the long and slender shotgun from his belt, and aimed over his left arm to the hideous face of the Materia Keeper. He fired a single shot, straight into one of the Materia Keeper's eyes. It responded with a terrible shriek that echoed throughout the mountains, and as it stepped back away from Vincent, it stamped its feet against the rock and making it shake. Dark green blood poured from its tiny, wounded eye. Looking up at the wounded creature, Vincent placed his shotgun back into its holster and raised his gaze to it. He stared for a few seconds before his dark red eyes suddenly flashed and came to life in a sea of fiery red. It was a fierceness that was sweeping through the darker colors in a wash of life and anger, and with that sudden surge of energy came another power that the man had kept hidden until then, and he began to change. It started off slowly at first, but increased in pace rapidly. From his eyes leaked a shade of dark purple that sank into his skin and began to spread across his face and neck, sinking underneath his clothes to the rest of his body. The skin of his face then began to thicken and bulge outwards, as though there was something living underneath his flesh that was trying to force its way out of him. From there things began to happen very quickly. Vincent keeled over so that he was on his knees as a deep orange glow suddenly swept up from his feet and surrounded his body. Within that deep, opaque glow his clothes were gradually burned away, and his dark hair was swept up into the air as shades of red and purple were forced through, pushing away the dark. The bulging and thickening of his skin continued all over the rest of his body, merging with the purple shade that had taken over him. By the time the transformation was complete, there was nothing left that could identify the new creature as Vincent. The glow faded to reveal a magnificent yet destructive beast. Many strong muscles and a sturdy structure had replaced Vincent's apparent frail form. His face was that of an angry beast, with the mane of purple-red hair falling loosely across his head and back, and even a tiny beard underneath his pointed muzzle. Cloud and the others all stared in awe and fear at the beast Vincent had become. The man had said very little about himself since they left Nibelheim, and they had thought him to be nothing more than a skilled gunman. Yet before their eyes they had seen a terrific transformation, from which the delicate-looking man had become a strong, fierce beast.
He turned into a monster,
cried Tifa.
So this is what the letter meant when it said scientifically altered,
Red 13 said calmly, limping across the rock. His own wound was still bleeding, but he was more entranced and intrigued by the new creature. He could still smell Vincent in the air, but that scent was now merged with the scent of the new beast.
Very interesting.
With the change complete, the new beast, known as Galleon, stormed forward and jumped up into the air. In mid-leap he roared loudly, so loud that the ground quaked beneath him. Sparks of light began to dot the air around the Materia Keeper, small at first but gradually growing larger. Then, in a sudden flash, they exploded. A shower of powerful flames erupted around the Materia Keeper, surrounding it on all sides so that it couldn't escape. Even though it had a natural resistance to flames, it did not expect the flames of Galleon to be so precise in finding the weak spots at the joints of its legs. Within seconds the flames filled those spots and burned the softer flesh, and the Materia Keeper crumpled onto the floor. This was their chance. With the Materia Keeper down, Cloud and the others all gathered round, ready to strike. Their materia at the ready, they now planned to destroy the monster, using its own favored item against it. Just as they had done to the beast in the safe in Shinra Mansion, the group together let off an onslaught of magic into the air. Bolts of lightning flashed, showers of ice fell, and storms of flames rose up from the earth and surrounded the Materia Keeper and making it shriek even louder. To one side Yuffie used her earth magic to make the ground beneath the monster shake and tremble, breaking up to create a pit. The Materia Keeper shuddered and collapsed into the hole, now completely vulnerable. Together, Eris and Kat cast a powerful wave of gravitational energy. It descended on the Materia Keeper and enveloped it, pushing it down. Its body was pulled completely out of proportion as it was pressed into the pit, its cry wavering and distorted, sounding as though it was crying from beneath the oceans. Galleon gave the final blow. With a final tremendous roar, he once again cast another wave of fiery balls that flew down to the Materia Keeper, as it lay pressed in the pit. Upon contact they exploded in another fierce shower of flames, blowing the gravitational field apart. The Materia Keeper went with it, and as both energy fields faded there was nothing left of the creature except for the pit. There was a moment of silence amongst the group as the last traces of energy faded away. They were all staring at the center of the pit where the Materia Keeper had been just seconds before. There wasn't a single trace of flesh left, nor could they feel its spirit seep away into the mountains. It had been completely obliterated. Galleon slowly floated down onto the ground, his clawed feet landing at the edge of the pit. The others turned their gazes upon him as a calmer blue glow silently rose up around him, blocking him from their sight again. By the time the glow died away there was nothing left of Galleon, and Vincent was standing in his place once again.
Vincent?
Said Tifa, braving to be the first one to break the silence.
How did you?
Vincent refused to answer, and he also refused to look at them. He just pulled out his shotgun, opened up the barrel, and looked inside. Then he pulled out a small case containing more bullets, and placed one into the barrel to replace the one he had used against the Materia Keeper. With that done he placed both the case and the gun away, and began to walk away from them, towards the mountain exit.
Well, ain't that you damn rude?
Commented Barrett, looking over at Vincent as he walked away from them.
You think he could have at least given an explanation?
He looked down at Red 13.
You reckon he's got something to hide?
Red 13 didn't look up. He was too busy licking away the blood from his hind leg. Thankfully the wound wasn't too deep or troublesome, and would heal quite quickly if it was given the time to heal. It was still quite painful, though.
He is quite mysterious,
the hound muttered between licks.
His scent is mostly human, but I also smell many unknown scents about him. I think what we just saw is just one of many forms or abilities.
He gave one final lick, seemed satisfied, and stood up.
Scientifically altered. I wonder. Whatever it isn't any of our business,
Cloud said coldly.
Let's just move on, shall we?
Barrett and Red 13 watched as Cloud walked briskly past them, following Vincent across the pit towards the exit of the mountains. Barrett watched them closely as they walked away in total silence, before he scowled angrily and shook his fist.
Damn. Feels like our team is CRAWLIN with ex-Shinra.
He snapped.
I swear if we get any more, I'm gonna scream.
Following their brisk and somewhat unusual battle against the Materia Keeper, the group of 8 continued to head through the mountains towards the exit. They were now heading back pretty much the way they had come, but on a different path that would lead them around the other side of the mountain and towards its exit, leaving them on the next part of the continent. Going deeper into the mountains would only lead them towards the Nibelheim reactor, but Cloud knew that Sephiroth wasn't heading there. Neither Cloud nor Vincent said anything as they walked on through the short stretch of winding path leading to the exit. They were both equally silent, both of them lost in their thoughts. The others, feeling uncomfortable by the almost hostile silence, made small talk amongst themselves. Mostly about the Shinra, where they could be heading. And even about the gold saucer, which felt like a world away from where they were right then. Vincent was thinking about Professor Hojo and Lucretia. He wondered how long it would be before he would run into the mad scientist again. All that time in his coffin inside Shinra Mansion had not subdued his anger for the scientist. And if traveling with Cloud and the others was the only way to find him, then so be it. And if they did indeed run into Sephiroth as well, then he would settle both problems at once. Cloud, of course, was once again thinking about Sephiroth. He had managed to still the rising anxiety that had hit him so harshly inside the Shinra Mansion, but he couldn't remove the memory. The cold fingers, so icy and hard, still gripped the deepest reaches of his mind, ensuring that Sephiroth didn't slip his mind for even a second. Finding Sephiroth. Stopping him from finding the promised land. And ending everything. That was what mattered the most.
Jenova will join the reunion, becoming a calamity from the skies.
Sephiroth's words continued to run through his mind, like a record that was stuck and repeating the same lines over and over. They were repeated so much that even after the record stopped the words could still be heard. Reunion? A calamity from the skies? It sounded like some sort of title. So did that mean that Jenova wasn't an ancient after all? If she wasn't, then Sephiroth wasn't an ancient, either. They had already seen Jenova on board the Shinra ship from Junon to Costa del Sol, reborn from an arm thrown down by Sephiroth. She had seemed to be intact then, so what was this reunion?
Are you going to participate in the reunion?
The word seemed to scream through Cloud's mind, like a nail scratching on the surface of a blackboard. It made his head throb and made a lump in Cloud's throat that he couldn't swallow or push away, and he felt a little dizzy and lightheaded. To pull himself back before he fainted, he gave his hair a sudden, sharp tug, making the back of his eyes sting.
Are you going to participate in the reunion? I wish I knew that the reunion was.
Cloud muttered under his breath. They eventually emerged from the mountains and back into the wide, grassy area of the Kyutai Plains. The change between the land of the mountains and the plains was instantaneous. The dark and lifeless stony floor suddenly stopped and was replaced by a land of lush and verdant grass. The cold, harsh air of the mountains was filled with life again, carrying with it the fresh scent of grass and the faint, salty smell of the ocean no more than a few hundred meters ahead of them. Free of the cold, bleak restraints of the mountains, Eris threw her staff down onto the ground. Forgetting about the others for a minute, she kicked off her boots and ran forward onto the grass, feeling its soft, tickly feeling on the soles of her feet. There was a gentle breeze blowing from the west, and she could smell the scent of flowers that were blossoming in the sunlight. They reminded her of her own flower garden, all that way back in Midgar. Looking up, Eris caught a flash of the sun shining high at the midday point. Warm rays were shining down on her, and right then all she wanted to do was lie back on the grass and watch the clouds go by. It was a truly picture-perfect moment. The others had also settled down on the grass, taking this moment to recuperate from their battle inside the mountain. Although there were no more monster attacks inside the mountain, they was aware of those outside the mountain. There was a small pack of Nibel wolves watching nearby, eyeing them over as potential prey. Tifa walked over to the nearby river and took off her gloves. Already the thick red leather was beginning to wear from all their fighting, she would have to replace them soon. Kneeling down, she dipped her fingers into the water and sighed, feeling the coolness against her skin. A shadow fell over her and she realized that Cloud had walked up beside her. He was looking out across the river towards Nibelheim, with their buggy still parked outside.
We'll be setting off soon,
Cloud said without looking at her.
Kat says the only other town around here is a place called Rocket Town about an hour's walk from here. We should be able to find it if we stick close to the mountain.
Tifa slowly nodded her head and looked back down at the water. She watched the water flow between her fingers, creating small bubbles of air as she swished her hand gently beneath the surface. Like the fire in Cosmo Canyon, she could see all sorts of things in the water. She found herself particularly looking at hers and Cloud's reflection, disjointed and wavering in the river's current.
Cloud.
she said softly, pulling her hand from the water.
Do you ever get the feeling that we're just being led somewhere? That we're not really choosing where we want to go?
Cloud looked down at her in surprise.
You mean like puppets on strings?
He asked.
Almost like that,
Tifa said. She gazed back down at the water.
It's like this river. We see ourselves in its reflection, but each drop is swept away of its own will.
She reached out and touched the surface of the water, watching it ripple.
We can't do anything about it, but we know where it's heading. I just wonder where we're heading. I guess I do feel like a puppet. Do you feel like that?
Cloud closed his eyes and thought for a moment.
I don't really know,
he admitted finally.
All I know is that if we keep following Sephiroth and the Shinra, then eventually we'll get somewhere.
He scratched his head.
I guess that's really not much help. No, it is,
said Tifa.
I just felt like I needed some assurance.
Cloud nodded.
Don't worry, Tifa,
he said.
It'll be fine.
His words seemed to reassure her, and she smiled faintly. Cloud wasn't surprised, she was feeling a little down. They had made their way across the ocean and across 2 continents, but still they had no idea where Sephiroth was heading or what he was up to. It was beginning to affect everyone. Except Vincent, that is, since no one could ever really tell what he was thinking.
Cloud. Tifa.
The two looked up as they saw Eris standing with the others at the corner of Mount Nebel.
Hurry up, or we'll leave you behind. Coming.
Tifa called back. She shook her hand dry and slipped her gloves back on. Pushing her hair away from her face as she stood up, she turned and headed back towards the others. After a few steps she stopped, and turned back to Cloud with a happy smile on her face.
Thanks, Cloud,
she added, before turning back and ran across the grass. End of chapter.